Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight we're traveling to the frozen edges of the world with 10 true Alaskan horror stories. Encounters that prove the real danger isn't always the cold. It's what's hiding in the dark. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's step into the frozen unknown together. Story number 1. I was kneeling in the snow, tightening the straps on my tripod, when it first hit me that I hadn't seen another person in nearly 3 days. That wasn't unusual for Svalbard, especially when you ventured away from Longyearbyen. But the silence pressed against me differently that evening. It was the kind of silence that made you check your own breath, just to confirm you hadn't gone deaf. I told myself it was the isolation messing with me, so I focused on the reason I had come. Capturing polar bears against the last streaks of twilight. My camera was ready, batteries warm against my chest pocket, and the lens already fogged slightly from my own breath. As I trudged toward the ridge, I kept scanning the snow for tracks. Bears leave broad impressions, but I found nothing but my own heavy boots behind me. My guide back in Longyearbyen had warned me not to wander too far, and certainly not without a rifle. But I wasn't here to shoot animals, I wanted to photograph them. I carried only a flare gun, tucked awkwardly in my coat. The cold pinched at my fingertips as I adjusted the camera again, whispering curses at my clumsy gloves. The light was fading faster than I expected, and I didn't want to waste it. When I finally reached the ridge, I froze. Down below, something dark shifted against the snow. For a moment, I thought it was a bear, but the shape was too narrow, too upright. I squinted, brought the camera up, and zoomed in. The lens shook slightly, but I steadied it against my knee. The viewfinder showed a tall figure standing still, facing directly toward me, though the distance was too far to make out details. I lowered the camera, blinked hard, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. My chest tightened. I tried to rationalize. Heat haze, a trick of contrast, maybe even an ice formation that looked human in shape. But none of those explanations sat right. I decided to retreat, heading back toward my tent before the darkness settled in completely. Each step felt heavier than the last, and though I kept glancing back, the ridge stayed empty. By the time I reached camp, I was sweating beneath my layers, the tent looking smaller and more fragile than ever. I zipped myself in and checked the camera, scrolling through the shots. Most were just pale stretches of snow, but one made me pause. It was slightly blurred, but clear enough to make out the shape of a person standing at a distance, facing me. The photo wasn't framed like the others. I hadn't pressed the shutter at that angle. My stomach dropped. I told myself I must have bumped the button by accident. That had to be it. But the nagging thought that someone else had taken it burrowed into my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I turned off the camera and shoved it into the sleeping bag with me, the weight of it pressing against my ribs as though to remind me it was there. Sleep came in restless fragments, each snap of wind against the tent jerking me awake. At one point, I swore I heard soft crunching outside, deliberate and paced. I held my breath, gripping the flare gun, listening so hard my ears ached. Nothing followed. When I woke, daylight had returned, and with it a brittle calm. I forced myself to believe the night had been a product of exhaustion. To prove it, I set up the tripod just outside the tent and let the camera run on a timed burst as I moved around camp, brewing instant coffee, checking gear, anything to fill the memory card. Later, I flipped through the shots quickly, mostly bored images of me hunched over the camp stove or fumbling with the tent poles. But then one froze me cold. It was an image of me lying in the sleeping bag, my face slack with sleep. The camera angle wasn't from the tripod. It was closer, angled downward, as though someone had leaned in right over me. My hands trembled as I scrolled back and forth to be sure. I hadn't dreamed that sound outside. Someone had been here. Panic set in fast. I tore through the tent, checking every seam, scanning for footprints outside. The wind had erased everything. No tracks, no sign of intrusion. Yet the photograph existed. I stuffed my belongings back into the pack, fumbling with the zippers, glancing over my shoulder constantly. The nearest settlement wasn't close, but staying seemed impossible. I decided to move, even if it meant trudging overnight. Anything was better than being watched in my sleep. Hours passed in a blur of white. My body ached from dragging the gear sled, but adrenaline pushed me on. When I stopped briefly to drink, I noticed something strange. My own tracks didn't line up. Parallel to my trail, faint but unmistakable, was another set of impressions. Not boot prints, something narrower, straighter, dragging as though someone had been walking just beyond my sight. I shouted into the open, my voice cracking, but the silence swallowed it instantly. I didn't wait for an answer. That night, I forced myself to set up the tent again, though I barely dared crawl inside. I sat upright with the flare gun across my lap, staring at the tent flap, whispering under my breath just to hear another human sound. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was the click. Not loud, but sharp, mechanical. My eyes shot open. The tent glowed faintly with morning light, but the sound had been unmistakable. The shutter of my camera. Heart pounding, I reached for it where I'd placed it under my coat. It was gone. I bolted outside, scanning in wild circles. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. But in the snow about 10 feet away lay the camera, upright as if carefully placed. I stumbled to it, grabbed it, and flipped through the playback. The last image made me gag. It was me again, sleeping in the bag, but closer this time. My lips parted, eyes shut, skin pale in the frame. And in the corner of the photo, a shadow loomed, curved like a shoulder, suggesting whoever held the camera had leaned in over me. I staggered, almost dropping it, bile rising in my throat. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to run, to keep moving until I reached safety. But another part of me needed answers. Who was doing this? How had they followed me without a trace? I shouted again, voice ragged. Stop it! Show yourself! The air answered only with wind. By the time I reached Longyearbyen the following evening, I was nearly delirious. My lips cracked from cold, and my eyes burned from sleeplessness. At the station, I collapsed into a chair and shoved the camera into the hands of the staff. I tried to explain between gasps, but the words tangled. They scrolled through the photos, frowning, whispering to one another. Then they reached the final image and grew still. The man holding the camera glanced at me, his face pale, and turned the screen around. The photo had changed. It no longer showed me sleeping. It showed me standing outside the station, right where I was now, pack slung over my shoulder, face blank. The timestamp was only minutes earlier, before I had arrived. I can't explain what happened after that without sounding mad. The staff checked the logs, swore I hadn't been seen until I stumbled in, but the evidence glared from the screen. Someone had been there, ahead of me, taking a picture I couldn't have posed for. I demanded to keep the camera, but they refused, muttering about turning it over for investigation. In the weeks since, I haven't picked up another lens. The thought of a shutter clicking makes my skin crawl. I know what I saw. I know what I felt breathing near me as I slept. And I know that the photos weren't mistakes or malfunctions. They were records. Proof that someone out there in that frozen wilderness watched me, studied me, and wanted me to know it. I tell you this not because I expect you to believe every word, but because I can still feel it. The certainty that if I ever return, The next set of photos will not just show me sleeping or walking. They'll show me vanishing, step by step, until nothing remains but snow and silence. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. Story number 2. I pressed my forehead against the frost on the train window, trying to make out anything beyond the blur of white. But there was nothing. Just a solid wall of snow sweeping sideways, swallowing the tracks, the land, the sky. We had been sitting still for hours, the train moaning under the weight of ice. People shuffled in their seats, some cursing under their breath, others whispering prayers. I remember thinking it was strange that no one from the crew had walked through the car in a long time. Normally there'd be a conductor checking tickets, but the silence had stretched so long it felt wrong, as if the whole train was holding its breath. When the heating system started failing, we knew we couldn't stay. You could see it in people's faces, the way they kept rubbing their hands together, stomping their feet, staring at the doors like trapped animals. Someone finally said we needed to move, get to the next station by foot, but I couldn't stop staring at the window. I thought I saw a shape outside, walking parallel to the train, but when I blinked, it vanished into the snow. My nerves were already tight, so I told myself it was just exhaustion. When the decision was made to abandon the train, everyone moved quickly. Scarves were pulled tight, coats buttoned to the throat. The doors shrieked when we forced them open, and the blizzard slammed into us with a force that stole the breath from my lungs. I stayed close to the others, trying to focus on the outline of bodies ahead of me. I remember my teeth aching from the cold, and the strange feeling that we weren't just leaving a train, we were leaving something unfinished behind. Hours later, after rescue teams finally found us, I was half delirious, stumbling into a small village station where they piled us in with hot drinks and blankets. People were counted, names written down, families huddled together. It was chaos, but in that chaos, something didn't add up. When the rescuers went back for belongings, they returned with more than bags and coats. They carried out a body. She looked maybe 15, lying stiff on the stretcher, snow crusted into her hair. Her skin was bluish-white, and her lips frozen into a faint shape that almost looked like she'd been trying to speak. But the strangest thing was that no one recognized her. Not one passenger raised their hand when the rescuers asked whose child she was. I watched the faces carefully, expecting someone to break, to admit something. But there was only silence, confused and horrified. The rescuers assumed she had been separated from another group, but I felt the air change in that room the second they set her down. Everyone felt it. I should have let it go. I should have wrapped myself in the blanket and shut my eyes like the others, but something made me move closer. I wanted to see her face, to be sure I hadn't overlooked her on the train. As I leaned down, I saw her fists were clenched tight. One of the rescuers pried them open to check for frostbite damage, and that's when a folded piece of paper slipped out. It wasn't paper, it was a train ticket. I felt my stomach tighten as I read the stamped date, January 2016, 30 years ahead of where we were. The ink was clear, the card crisp, not aged at all. I stared at it so long one of the men asked if I was all right. I lied and nodded, slipping back before anyone else asked questions. But my mind kept circling the same thought. How could a girl in 1966 have a ticket from 2016? That night, while others tried to sleep on benches and floors, I couldn't. My ears still rang with the howl of the blizzard, and my thoughts kept dragging me back to her pale face. I needed answers, but every time I opened my mouth to speak about the ticket, something in me froze. I didn't want them to think I was hallucinating. Maybe I didn't want to admit to myself what I'd seen. The next morning, officials arrived to question us. They asked for names, routes, reasons for travel. I kept waiting for them to mention the girl, to ask if anyone had seen her board. But when I tried to bring it up, they shut me down. There was no girl listed on the passenger log, one officer said firmly. I argued, told him I'd seen her body with my own eyes. He looked at me with this tired expression and said, "You were cold, hungry, disoriented. People see things in storms. But storms don't leave tickets with dates 3 decades in the future." 2 days later, I returned secretly to the storage room where they kept the belongings recovered from the train. I told myself I just wanted to confirm it, maybe even convince myself I'd been wrong. But when I found the box with unclaimed items, I saw it immediately. The ticket. Neat, folded, untouched by weather. I picked it up with trembling hands, and this time I noticed something else. On the back, written faintly in pencil, were words, "I don't belong here." My throat went dry. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching. But I was alone. I wanted to drop the ticket and run, but instead, I tucked it into my coat. I don't know why. Maybe part of me thought holding on to it would tether me to the truth, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. When I left Norilsk weeks later, I carried it with me. For years, I kept it hidden inside a book, never speaking of it. But strange things began happening. In 1977, on a business trip, I woke on a train to see a girl sitting across from me. She was pale, hair damp as if from melting snow. She looked exactly like the one we'd found. She didn't speak. She just stared. And when I blinked, the seat was empty. I told myself I was dreaming, but I reached into my bag and felt the ticket, warm against my fingers, as if it had just been printed. In 1989, I finally showed it to a close friend. He laughed at first, said maybe I'd forged it. But when he turned it over and read the pencil words, his face drained of color. He asked how long I'd had it. When I told him, he swore under his breath and shoved it back at me, saying never to bring it near him again. That was the last time I saw him. He disappeared a year later. His family claimed he'd gone traveling. I couldn't shake the idea that it was connected. By the time 2016 finally came, I was an old man. I had spent decades waiting, wondering if something would happen on that date, the one stamped on the ticket. When the day arrived, I avoided trains completely, but curiosity gnawed at me, so I went to the station anyway, standing at the edge of the platform. That's when I saw her again. Same girl, same age, unchanged. She walked calmly toward the tracks, holding a ticket in her hand. The same as mine. People around her didn't seem to notice her, stepping aside as if she weren't there. I called out, voice cracking, but she didn't turn. She stepped onto the train that had just arrived, and before I could move, the doors shut, and it pulled away. I stood frozen, my whole body shaking, certain I had just watched time fold in on itself. I pulled the old ticket from my pocket, but it was gone. In its place was a fresh one, the ink still drying. Stamped, January 1966. That was the moment I understood. She hadn't been from the future. She had been trapped in a loop, carried back and forth through time on that cursed line. Somehow, I had become part of it the moment I touched the ticket. Maybe she wanted someone to carry it, someone else to bear the weight. I never boarded a train again. I walked, I drove, I flew when I had to, but I never set foot on rails. Still, sometimes, I wake in the night and hear the muffled screech of metal wheels, the rattling of carriages over frozen tracks. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel the weight of paper in my palm, light and cold, stamped with a date that hasn't come yet. I tell you this because I can't carry it alone anymore. You might not believe me, but if one day you find yourself on a train in a snowstorm, and a pale girl sits down across from you holding a ticket that looks too new to be real, do not look at her hands. Do not take what she offers, because once you touch it, you'll never be free of the journey. And if you think this is just an old man's rambling, then ask yourself one thing. Why, even now, as I sit here with you, do I feel the faint pressure of paper between my fingers, though my hands are empty? Why do I still hear the whistle of a train long buried under snow? Because some rides never end, my friend. Some tickets never expire. Story number 13. Story number 3. I was halfway down the main street when I noticed the first glove. A red one, lying flat against the snow like someone had dropped it in a hurry. At first, I barely thought about it. People lost things all the time, and during the pandemic the streets were emptier than usual. But when I glanced again, I realized something strange. It looked new. No snow piled on top of it, no dampness soaking through. Just sitting there like it had been placed moments ago. I walked past, but something in me twisted, urging me to stop. I turned around, bent down, and picked it up. It was warm inside, as though it had just come off someone's hand. I remember slipping it over my fingers almost without thinking. It fit perfectly. Too perfectly. Like it had been tailored for me. I pulled it off again quickly, frowning, because I didn't like the way that felt. I stuffed it in my coat pocket, telling myself it didn't matter, but when I looked up, I saw another glove lying a few yards ahead. Identical. Another red one, stretched open against the snow. I stood there for a long second, debating. Part of me wanted to keep walking, go straight home, shut the door, forget about it. But another part of me was caught. It was the eeriest thing, like the gloves weren't random but waiting for me. I walked forward, slow at first, then faster, and when I picked up the second glove, I slid it on without hesitation. Again, perfect fit. My chest tightened because I don't even wear gloves. I hadn't worn a pair in months. That was when I noticed the third glove, farther down, leading away from the hospital road. And beyond it, a fourth. A trail. My mouth went dry. I whispered to myself, "No, this is stupid," but my feet kept moving. Each glove I found was warm inside. Each one slid on like it had been mine all along. I don't know how long I followed that trail, but my nerves built with every step. The town was nearly silent that night. Most people were home, avoiding each other. No footsteps in the snow, no distant car sounds, not even the usual hum of life. Just me, my breath, and those gloves. By the time I reached the 10th one, my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it. I stopped dead when I saw what was waiting at the end. There was no 11th glove, just a small rectangle half buried in the snow. I crouched down slowly, brushing it off with shaking fingers. My throat closed. It was my hospital ID card, the one clipped to my scrubs every day, the one still attached to me when I left the building an hour ago. I reached to my chest, panicked, and found it was gone. I stood up so fast my vision blurred. Every instinct screamed to run. I clutched the ID card and spun in circles, searching the silent street. Nothing. Nobody. But the dread pressing in on me was so heavy, it felt physical, like something breathing against the back of my neck. I shoved the card into my pocket and told myself to get home. Right now. The moment I turned, I realized I wasn't alone. Across the snow, just beyond the last street lamp, there were footprints, fresh ones, pressed deep into the powder. Not mine. Too large. They led away into the dark. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to believe they belonged to someone who had simply dropped the gloves. But if that was true, why did they all fit me? Why was my ID card at the end? I forced myself forward, past the lamp, past those tracks, until I reached the corner. My apartment wasn't far. Every step felt like a dare, like if I looked over my shoulder, I'd see someone just close enough to touch me. But I didn't look. I couldn't. When I finally reached my door, I nearly dropped my keys trying to get them in the lock. Inside, I slammed it shut, bolted it, and leaned against it, gasping like I'd outrun something. I pulled the gloves out of my pockets and threw them on the table. I didn't want them near me. My ID card, though, I kept that clenched in my hand. I checked the clip again and again, making sure it was still there, trying to convince myself I'd just been careless. Maybe it had fallen off earlier, and some kind stranger found it, leaving it with the gloves. That made sense. It had to. I tried to sleep that night, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound of snow crunching outside my window. At one point, I thought I actually heard it. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. I pulled the blankets over my head like a child, shaking, and I didn't lift them until morning light pushed through the curtains. The gloves were gone. I swear to you, I left them on the table. But when I stumbled into the kitchen, they weren't there. The ID card was, though, sitting neatly on top of a folded napkin. I hadn't put it there. My hands shook as I picked it up. Someone had been in my apartment. I called the landlord first, asked if anyone else had keys. He said no, not anymore, not since the locks were changed last spring. I didn't tell him the real reason I was asking. I didn't tell anyone. I just went to work like normal, tried to push it down. But the moment I walked into the hospital, a chill ran through me, because my badge beeped red at the scanner. Denied. The receptionist frowned, tried it herself, and shook her head. Weird. System doesn't recognize you. I laughed nervously, made some excuse, and got a temporary sticker. But inside, I was panicking. If my ID card didn't register, whose card was in my pocket? That night, I triple-checked the locks, shoved a chair against the door, and sat up with every light on. Around 2 a.m, I noticed something sticking out from under the door frame. My breath caught. Another red glove. Slowly pushed inside. I didn't touch it. I sat frozen, staring at it until the sky lightened. When I finally worked up the courage to grab it, I found a slip of paper tucked inside. In shaky handwriting, it read, "You look better in red." I don't remember. Crying? But I must have, because my pillow was wet when I finally dozed off. When I woke, the glove and the note were gone. Over the next week, it didn't stop. Every day when I left the hospital, I found a glove in my path. Sometimes on the street, sometimes balanced on the hood of my car, once even inside my locker at work. Nobody ever saw who left them. Each time, the ID card moved places in my apartment, as if someone was carrying it around and putting it back before I noticed. Finally, I told myself enough. I couldn't live like that. I decided to stay with a coworker for a few nights. I packed quickly, trying not to think about it, stuffing clothes into a bag. When I zipped it shut, I froze. Sitting on top of my folded scrubs inside the bag was the entire set of red gloves, stacked neatly, one on top of the other. I dropped the bag, my legs nearly giving out. The ID card was on top again, perfectly centered. I screamed then, full, raw terror that came from somewhere deep in me. I didn't care who heard. I ran out, left everything behind, pounding on my neighbor's door until they let me in. The police came later. They searched my apartment, found nothing. No fingerprints except mine. No forced entry. They almost looked at me like I was losing it. One officer finally asked if maybe the stress of the pandemic was getting to me. I didn't argue. What else could I say? But I knew what I'd lived through. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew, most of all, that the gloves weren't random. They had been leading me, pulling me along, step by step, until I found myself trapped in someone else's game. I never went back to that apartment. I transferred to a different hospital, moved into staff housing, and told myself it was over. But sometimes, when I'm walking home late after a shift, I still look down at the snow. And when I see a speck of red against the white, my whole body freezes. Because deep down, I'm terrified that one day I'll reach into my pocket and find the gloves already there, warm, waiting, like they never left me at all. Story number 4. I was adjusting the dial on the radio, not because I expected to hear anything, but because silence can drive a man mad when the dogs are sleeping and the wind has settled. It had been 3 nights since I left Sissimute for the hunting grounds, and my mind was restless. At first it came across as static, broken pulses that almost mimicked the crack of ice splitting. Then, through the crackle, a voice slipped in. Not Danish, not Greenlandic, not English. I don't know what it was, but the tone wasn't casual. It was sharp, hurried, and it carried that unmistakable weight of someone begging for help. I sat there with my mittens pulled off, my fingers already stinging, pressing my ear close to the radio's worn speaker. The words didn't make sense, but the rhythm of panic was universal. I whispered out loud, "Who are you?" as if that mattered. My dogs stirred, sensing something, tails flicking but not barking. That unsettled me more than the sound itself. They always barked at the unexpected. This time they just listened, ears angled toward the radio like they too could hear the fear. The next night, the signal came again, at almost the same time, only louder, more frantic. I didn't imagine it. A second voice joined, higher, shrill with terror. I tried writing down fragments, copying sounds phonetically, but the language twisted and looped in ways I couldn't place. The only clear part was the rhythm of their distress calls. Someone, or something, was desperate. My instinct told me to switch it off, crawl into the furs, and pretend I had never heard it. But hunters rely on instinct, and mine wasn't telling me to rest. It was telling me to find where those voices came from. I checked the compass, compared my position, tried to triangulate the signal's direction, but my tools were useless against the distortion. The voices didn't travel like normal radio chatter. They slid around, as though they came from every angle at once. I muttered curses under my breath, half at myself, half at the radio, and half at the empty horizon that seemed to mock me. My father used to warn me that curiosity is a heavier burden than hunger, and that night I carried both. I told myself I'd turn back in the morning. Instead, when the dogs woke, I pointed them west toward a fjord where I had no reason to go. It wasn't for hunting, it wasn't for trade. It was because I couldn't stop thinking about that woman's scream through the static. As the sled cut across the ice, my mind replayed it in fragments, as if my brain wanted to translate something it had no vocabulary for. By the 4th day, I stopped sleeping properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of voices calling from under the ice. Not in words, but in those same panicked tones. When I woke, my throat hurt as though I'd been screaming back at them. My dogs grew restless, refusing to eat properly, glancing back at me with eyes that seemed to ask questions I couldn't answer. I kept patting their fur, whispering nonsense, pretending to reassure them when I couldn't even reassure myself. It all came to a head the night I heard my own name in the static. Clear as anything. Anders. My breath caught in my chest so hard I thought I'd swallowed the cold. My mother's voice. I hadn't heard her in years since she died. But there it was, bent and cracked by the radio, calling for me like she was just outside the tent. I remember saying aloud, "That's not real. That's not real." But my hand still shook as I reached to turn the dial. The static screamed, cut out, and then there was silence. Not the ordinary kind, but a silence so deep I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The next morning, one of my best dogs refused to rise. She just lay there, head flat against the snow, eyes dull. When I touched her, her body was warm but trembling like she'd run all night in her dreams. I fed her by hand, but she barely chewed. I knew then this trip had gone too far. But I didn't turn back. I told myself I needed to understand, to see this through. Maybe that was foolish. No, definitely it was. 2 days later, I crested a ridge overlooking the fjord. That's where I saw the wreckage. Metal twisted like dried kelp, bits of hull scattered across the ice. A ship, but not like any I'd ever seen. Too small to be a trawler, too bulky to be for research. It had no markings I could recognize, no flags, no numbers, just a broken skeleton left half buried in snow. My stomach knotted itself in fear and fascination. My dogs whined low, tails tucked, refusing to move closer. I dragged the sled by hand, step by step, crunching over the frost until the radio in my pack buzzed alive on its own. This time there was no mistaking it. The voices were coming from here. Louder, clearer, overlapping as if dozens were all crying at once. The moment I touched the metal hull, the voices cut to silence. The dogs barked once, sharp, as though in warning, then fell silent too. I remember whispering, "Please don't leave me." But I didn't know if I meant the dogs, the voices, or myself. Inside the wreckage, it smelled wrong. Not rot, not rust, something else. Something stale, metallic, and bitter like burnt wires mixed with brine. I found no bodies, no bones. Just equipment shattered beyond recognition. Wires gnawed through as though chewed, not cut. The walls bore scratches, deep and uneven, as if made by hands or claws desperate to escape. And near the back, frozen in a block of ice, I found a radio just like mine, except the microphone was clutched in the stiff hand of someone who should have been dust decades ago. I stumbled back, gagging, certain I was looking at the source. But then my own radio burst alive again, screaming so loud I dropped it. The voice was mine this time. My own voice, begging, gasping, repeating, "Help me, please," over and over. I covered my ears, but it didn't stop. It wasn't in the radio anymore. It was in the metal, in the air, in the ground beneath my boots. My dogs howled, pulling against their ties, trying to break free. And then, as suddenly as it started, silence. I grabbed the radio, stumbled out of the wreck, and ran. I don't remember hitching the dogs back to the sled. I don't remember the first mile. All I remember is running until my lungs gave out, falling face first into the snow, and screaming into the ice like an animal. When I finally looked up, the wreck was gone. I swear on my life it wasn't there anymore. Just endless white, like it had been swallowed whole. The days after blur together. I kept moving, half dead, half crazed, following no compass, just desperate to see a human face again. My dogs dragged me more than I led them. And when we finally reached the outskirts of Sisimiut, something strange happened. The lead husky stopped, circled back, and dropped something into my lap. It was the radio, not the one I carried. A different one, strapped to his harness, coated in frost. My stomach turned to stone when I recognized it. It was the frozen radio I'd seen clutched in that hand inside the wreck. I carried it into the village, shaking, muttering, probably looking like a madman. I told the elders what I had found. They stared at me with blank faces, nodding but not asking questions. That's when I realized they knew something. They'd heard of this before. One of the old men finally said, "The ice speaks. You shouldn't have answered." That was all. No explanation, no comfort. Just a warning too late. I never hunted again after that. I kept the radio locked away. but sometimes at night it still crackles to life. The voices are softer now, faded like echoes through a tunnel, but they always end the same way, with my own voice calling for help, repeating words I never said. I've thought of smashing it, throwing it into the sea, burying it in the snow. But what if the voices just move on to another signal, another poor soul with restless fingers on a dial? So I keep it. I keep it locked away, heavy as guilt, silent most days but never forgotten. When the static rises, I cover my ears, but it doesn't matter. I still hear them. I hear her, my mother, calling my name. Not the woman she was, but something else wearing her tone. And every time I hear her say, "Anders," I think about walking back to that fjord, about letting the ice take me the way it wanted to the first time. I don't tell this story often. People think isolation makes you see things, hear things, lose your grip. Maybe they're right. Maybe I was tired, starved, broken by the cold. But then they ask why my sled dogs came home with 2 radios. They don't have an answer for that. No one does. And neither do I, except this. Whatever I found out there is still out there. Still speaking. Still waiting for someone else to listen. Story number 5. They told me I should never speak about it again, but I can't hold it inside any longer. The memory has been clawing at me for decades, and sometimes I wake in the night, still hearing their voices. Back then, in 1983, I was a schoolteacher in Yakutsk. I was only 24, nervous but eager, assigned to take my class of 12 children on a short excursion outside the city. It was supposed to be a simple winter outing, a walk through the snowy paths near the frozen Lena River, where we would practice observational writing. Nothing more. I remember lining them up before we left, their cheeks pink from the cold, scarves pulled tight around their chins. They teased each other about who would fall in the snow first, and I carried the thermos of tea I had promised them. I counted their faces, one by one, like I always did. 12 in total. Their parents waved from the school steps, proud and trusting. I felt the weight of that trust, but I smiled back, certain I could manage. I had no idea that trust would be the thing to destroy me. We set off, crunching through snow, our boots sinking deep. I recall the sound of their laughter bouncing off the ice. At first, I was nervous about the silence of the forest, but the children kept me distracted with questions about the trees, the birds, even the distant hum of the river under the ice. I kept answering patiently, though my eyes never stopped counting them. I was strict about that. I looked to my left, then to my right, making sure no one strayed. 12 little bodies moving behind me. Always 12. After an hour, I called for a rest. We stopped near a clearing, and I poured tea into small cups, steam rising in the frigid air. The children huddled close, their mittens clumsy against the cups, but their eyes bright with warmth. I swear to you I heard them giggle, cough, speak to me, one after another. I saw their breath fogging the air. They were there, every single one of them. But when we packed up and started walking back toward the city, something felt strange. The footsteps behind me seemed lighter, fewer. The chatter I had grown used to faded. I turned my head, ready to scold them for lagging behind, and my heart nearly burst out of my chest. There was no one. The trail behind me was empty, nothing but my own footprints in the snow leading back the way we came. I froze, scanning every direction. "Children," I called out, my voice sharp. "Stop hiding. This isn't funny." My shout cracked in the air and echoed. Nothing answered. My stomach tightened in panic. I dropped the thermos, letting it sink into the snow, and I started running back down the path, certain I would find them crouched behind trees or rolling in laughter at their prank. But there were no indentations, no signs of play, not even an extra boot mark. Only my tracks. Just mine. I remember falling to my knees, clawing at the snow, praying I would uncover some hidden tunnel where they had scrambled off. My fingers went numb. The silence pressed in, and I screamed their names, each one, over and over until my throat felt raw. No answer, not even the echo anymore. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. I staggered back to the school in a haze of terror. Parents were waiting, arms crossed against the cold, chatting casually as if nothing was wrong. The sight of them nearly broke me. When they asked where the children were, I stammered, "What children?" My mouth betrayed me. The words came out before I could stop them, as if they weren't mine. I tried to correct myself, to say their names, but nothing came. My mind told me I had left with 12, but my voice insisted I had left alone. The parents' smiles faded. Their eyes narrowed. They pushed past me, rushing into the school, shouting for their sons and daughters. I followed, trembling, trying to make sense of my own betrayal. Inside, they ran to the classrooms, the lockers, the gymnasium. They demanded answers from the headmaster, who stared at me in confusion. "What trip? You weren't assigned a trip today?" he said. My knees buckled. I argued with him, desperate, describing the forms I had signed, the outing I had planned, but he pulled the papers from the office files, blank and unmarked. No record of permission, no list of names, no schedule. Nothing. The parents began shouting at me, grabbing my coat, screaming the names of their children. I remember one mother clutching my sleeve with icy hands, demanding to know where her daughter was. I tried to say, "I saw her laughing, I gave her tea," but the words never formed. My tongue twisted. All that came out was, "I was alone." I heard myself say it like a stranger, like a recording I couldn't stop. The rage in their eyes was unbearable. The police were called. I sat for hours in a small room, staring at my own shaking hands while an officer asked me the same questions again and again. How many children had I taken? Who authorized it? Which direction had we gone? I wanted to scream the truth, to tell him everything. But when I opened my mouth, only one sentence spilled out again and again. I was alone. The more I repeated it, the more I began to doubt myself. Maybe I had gone insane. Maybe I had imagined the children. But their parents remembered them. They had kissed them goodbye that morning. How could all of us be wrong? Days passed. The school records showed nothing. Birth certificates for the children suddenly disappeared from government files. Even family photographs turned blank. Empty chairs at birthday tables, mothers holding air instead of babies. Parents clutched at these photographs in horror, begging others to believe them. I watched grown men collapse to the floor, sobbing for children they could no longer prove had ever existed. And still, whenever anyone turned to me for explanation, I could only whisper, I was alone. They released me after weeks of questioning, but the city treated me as a curse. Parents avoided me on the street. Colleagues resigned rather than share a building with me. Rumors spread that I had traded the children to some nameless force, that I was marked by the permafrost itself. I left Yakutsk, moved to a distant village where no one knew me, but the shame never left. Years later, I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of collective delusion. Stress, grief, hysteria. I buried it deep. But one evening, decades after, I found an old trunk in my apartment filled with things I didn't remember packing. Inside were 12 scarves, stiff with frost, folded neatly. I touched one, and I swear I felt it quiver in my hand, warm as if it had just been taken off a child's neck. My stomach turned. I shoved them back into the trunk, locked it, and threw the key into the river. You asked me once why I never had children of my own. This is why. I couldn't trust myself to keep them safe. Not when I still hear laughter in the snow. Not when I sometimes see tiny boot prints outside my window, even though I live alone. I know what you're thinking, that I lost my mind back then and never found it again. But I promise you, I didn't imagine those children. I counted them. I held their mittens. I heard them. They were real. And yet every record says otherwise. It's as if they were erased, not just from paper, but from the world. I think about their parents often, how they looked at me with both rage and desperation. They wanted someone to blame, but I couldn't even give them that. All I could give was silence, or those cursed words. Sometimes I wonder if I was chosen to be their messenger, to carry the emptiness left behind. Other times I think I was punished, condemned to live with memories no one else is allowed to keep. I'm telling you this now because last week, for the first time in 40 years, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 12 names written in a child's careful handwriting. The same names of my class that day. At the bottom, it said only, "We are still waiting for you." I tore it up, but I can't stop shaking. I don't know if I should run, confess, or follow. But I know one thing for certain. The excursion never ended. I'm still on it. And sooner or later I'll have to finish the walk back. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. Story number 6. I was stirring the pot of soup when the first gust rattled the cabin walls, and my daughter, Elena, dropped her crayons to look up at me. The sound wasn't like normal wind. It had weight, like something slamming against the boards. I told her not to worry, that it was only a storm, but inside I felt my chest tighten. It was early May in Ulu. Storms happened, yes, but not ones that came this fast or this hard. By the time I ladled soup into bowls, the snow outside had grown so thick it pressed against the window like a white curtain, hiding the world beyond. Elena pushed the bowl aside after only a few sips. She was restless, glancing toward the door every few minutes. "Mama, I heard something," she whispered. I paused, the spoon halfway to my lips, and asked what she meant. She said she heard her name, soft but clear, like someone calling her from the yard. I told her it was the wind carrying sounds through the trees, but she shook her head. "It was Papa's voice," she said. My throat tightened. Her father had died 2 years earlier, and she knew that. I forced a smile, told her her mind was playing tricks, but I felt my spoon tremble against the bowl. I tried distracting her with a story, something light, but the storm only grew louder, and she kept turning toward the door. Then came the sound. Faint, muffled by snow, but unmistakable. Someone calling her name. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. I heard it too. The voice had that lilt I once knew so well. I wanted to believe it was only the wind, but my skin crawled with recognition. Elena jumped up, ran to the door, and pressed her ear against the wood. I shouted for her to step away, but she whispered back to me, "Mama, it's really him. He's out there." My instinct was to grab her, hold her close, but curiosity clawed at me. I cracked the window an inch, enough to let the icy air sting my cheeks. Snow swirled furiously, blinding, but over the howl I heard it again. "Elena." My heart stuttered. It was his tone exactly, the way he'd say her name when she'd fallen asleep on his lap. For a moment, I wanted to throw open the door and run into that storm, to believe in the impossible. But reason slammed into me. He was gone. He had been buried. I had seen the coffin lowered. This could not be him. I slammed the window shut, my hands shaking. Elena cried that I was cruel, that I was keeping her from her father. She said she needed to let him in because he must be cold. I knelt, holding her face in my hands, and told her it was not him, no matter how real it sounded. She wept, twisting against me, but I kept my arms around her. Then, as though to prove me wrong, The voice grew louder, closer, calling her name again and again, each time with more urgency. I pressed my hands over her ears, but she shoved them away. "He needs me, Mama." The banging started soon after. 3 sharp knocks on the door, spaced like deliberate knocks from a visitor. Nearly screamed. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm for her sake. I whispered that no matter what, she must not open that door. She pouted, clenching her fists, but she nodded. We sat there on the floor, the storm screaming around us, and the knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the wood. My mind spiraled. Who could be outside in such a storm? No sane person could survive long in that cold. And yet someone was calling in the voice of a man buried years ago. I thought of neighbors, maybe playing a cruel trick, but none lived close enough. Our cabin sat alone at the edge of the forest, and the nearest farm was kilometers away. No one would travel here in this weather. And still the knocking persisted. Patient, like whoever or whatever was out there had all the time in the world. I shouted that they had the wrong house, that they must leave us alone. The only reply was Alina's name, called again in that voice that wasn't possible. She sobbed into my chest, begging me to let her see him. My own tears burned my eyes, because part of me wanted to believe too. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. The storm howled, but the knocking and the voice were gone. Alina eventually cried herself to sleep, her small body curled against mine. I didn't sleep. I sat awake, staring at the door, listening to every creak. When dawn came, the snow outside had piled nearly to the windowsill. The world was silent, blanketed, as though nothing had happened. I dared to open the door a crack. The snow came up to my knees instantly, but there were footprints, clear and deep, leading from the forest to our door. They stopped right there, facing us, and didn't go back. I slammed the door shut again, my stomach twisting. Alina woke and asked if Papa had left. I told her yes, but my voice cracked. All day she moped, staring at the door as if waiting for him to return. I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, boiling water, anything to distract myself. By late afternoon, the wind picked up again, and just as the light began to dim, the voice returned. Alina. This time it was closer, almost as if whispered inside the walls. She screamed with joy and ran to the door before I could grab her. She yanked it open. The blast of snow nearly knocked us both over. I screamed at her to shut it, but she stood in the doorway, eyes wide, staring into the white chaos outside. Her lips moved, whispering, "Papa!" I lunged, pulling her back, slamming the door closed with all my strength. She fought me, clawing at my arms, screaming that I was stealing him from her. I held her until she collapsed into sobs, rocking her like I had when she was little. My own body shook uncontrollably. I knew what I heard, but I also knew it was not him. Whatever wore his voice wanted her. Not me. Her. Night fell heavy. The storm battered the walls, and I barely dared to breathe. Then the windows rattled, and I saw movement outside, shapes shifting against the snow. I pulled Alina into the bedroom, locked the door, and pressed a chair beneath the handle. She whimpered, half asleep, murmuring for her father. I whispered into her hair that she had me, that I would not let anything take her. For hours we sat in the dark, until exhaustion finally dragged us into sleep. When I woke, it was quiet. Too quiet. The storm had stopped. I opened my eyes to see Alina's bed empty. Panic shot through me like ice water. I leapt up, screaming her name, tearing through the cabin. The front door was ajar, snow spilling inside. My hands shook so violently I could barely grab my boots. I ran outside barefoot first, screaming into the stillness, the air slicing my throat raw. Her small footprints trailed across the yard, leading toward the forest. I chased them, stumbling through the knee-high snow, sobbing, shouting her name. The prints were steady, purposeful, as if she'd been calmly following someone. I screamed until my voice broke, but no reply came. After what felt like forever, the tracks ended at a frozen stream. On the other side, there were none, just blank snow, untouched. I collapsed there, my chest heaving, tears freezing on my cheeks. She was gone. I called again and again, my voice echoing back at me. But there was nothing. Only silence. I don't know how long I stayed kneeling there before the cold forced me back. The cabin felt empty, hollow, like a grave. I searched every corner, every drawer, as if she might be hiding. Nothing. The soup pot still sat on the table, a reminder of the night before. I curled into her bed, clutching her pillow, rocking like a mad woman. Then, as I began to drift into delirium, I heard it again. Her small voice outside the window calling for me. Not for Papa. For me. It was her voice, soft and pleading. But I knew better now. I stayed still, biting my fist to stop from answering. By morning, the search party came. The storm had broken, and neighbors who'd worried over our silence fought through the drifts to reach us. They found me curled on the floor, barely coherent. I told them everything, my words tumbling over each other. They searched the forest, the stream, everywhere, but there was no sign of Alina. The only evidence were those footprints, ending in the middle of the snow. People whispered theories. Disorientation, the storm taking her. But I know what I heard. I know who called her name. The years since have been a blur of grief and questions that never end. Sometimes at night, when the wind howls, I still hear her. Sometimes it's his voice again, sometimes hers. Always outside, always calling. And though every part of me aches to run to them, I never open the door. Because I know if I do, I won't come back either. Story number 7. I was knee-deep in the snow, my hands numb through the gloves, when my shovel hit something solid. At first I thought it was another rock, but the sound was too sharp, metallic. "Hey, come check this out," I called to Emil and Sophie, who were dragging their gear across the slope behind me. We'd been out there for hours, just killing time, students messing around in the Greenlandic backcountry during winter break. None of us expected to actually find anything. But there it was, buried beneath layers of hard-packed ice, a rusted metal box with wires curled like veins. Emil crouched down, brushing snow off with his mitten. "Looks Soviet," he muttered. He had a fascination with Cold War relics, and was always half hoping to stumble onto something left behind. Sophie rolled her eyes, but I saw the spark in hers, too. It wasn't every day you dug up something like this. I jammed the shovel under one corner and pried until it cracked loose. The thing was heavier than it looked, shaped like a small suitcase with knobs, dials, and a corroded antenna bent at an awkward angle. The three of us just stared at it, the cold forgotten for a moment. "Think it works?" Emil asked. I shrugged, but something in my gut twisted. We should have left it there, I know that now, but we were 20, invincible, and stupid. Sophie laughed nervously. "What's the worst that could happen? We summon some old KGB ghost?" She was joking, but her voice cracked a little. We hauled it back to the small cabin we'd rented near Nook, leaving a trail of melted snow as we dragged it inside. Emil found an old adapter in his gear kit, and before I could even say anything, he was plugging it into the wall. The lights in the cabin flickered, then steadied, and the transmitter came to life with a deep, guttural hum. At first, there was just static, loud and uneven, like the sound of ice cracking on a lake. Then, through the hiss, came a voice. Clear, Danish, heavily accented. You don't know me, it said. We all froze. Sophie's hand shot to the power cord, but Emil shook his head. Wait. The voice continued, steady and calm, like it had been waiting to speak. I am telling you what I did. No one ever found her. They won't. Not under the bridge. I swear to you, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a recording. It was live. It had the strange cadence of someone confessing, not performing. Emil leaned closer, wide-eyed. Holy shit, it's some kind of radio journal. Like, pirate confessions? The voice named streets we knew in Nook, described walking late at night, a girl, a struggle. Sophie grabbed my wrist so tight I thought she might break it. This isn't funny. Turn it off. But Emil couldn't pull himself away. His face was pale but transfixed, like he was addicted to every word. I felt myself leaning too, against my better judgment, because the detail was impossible to fake. The creak of the bridge the man described? I'd heard it myself, biking over it in the summer. Then the frequency shifted. The static spat and cleared, and another voice came through. This one, younger, almost trembling. My uncle. He doesn't know I saw him bury it. I can't tell anyone. He'll kill me too. I looked at Sophie, and she mouthed, What the hell is this? She pulled out her phone, hit record, but the moment she did, the transmitter screeched, a sound so sharp it rattled my teeth. We all covered our ears. When it settled, the voice was gone. Only silence. We sat there for a long time, the hum of the transmitter filling the room. Emil finally spoke. Do you realize what this is? These are live confessions, things no one's supposed to know. He looked at me like he'd just discovered treasure. If we record them, we could... Stop, I snapped. You don't know what you're messing with. This isn't just old radio chatter. My chest felt heavy. Every instinct screamed at me to unplug it, throw it back into the snow, bury it deeper than we'd found it. But I didn't. I let Emil talk me into keeping it running. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, listening as Emil fiddled with the dials. Every so often, I'd hear another voice drift through. Sometimes it was only fragments. Someone crying, someone whispering names, a man muttering dates like he was keeping count. Around 3 a.m., Emil shook me awake, eyes wild. You need to hear this. I stumbled over, heart pounding, and pressed my ear close. The voice was female, steady, almost detached. It was my son. I had no choice. The water was too cold, and he was too heavy. I told the police he slipped. I recoiled, bile rising in my throat. Jesus Christ, Emil, this is sick. He just stared at me, mouth slightly open. Don't you get it? These are real people, real crimes, things that were never solved. He turned to Sophie, but she had her face buried in her hands, sobbing quietly. I'd never seen her break like that before. The next morning we tried to act normal, but the tension clung to us like frost. Sophie wouldn't look at either of us. Emil kept fiddling with the transmitter, scribbling notes in his journal. Me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air. When we finally stepped outside, it was as if the whole town was watching us. I swear, people's eyes lingered too long. A man at the corner store stared at Emil until he left without buying anything. When I asked what that was about, Emil just muttered, He knows. By the second night, the voices started calling names. Not just random names, our names, first mine. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. You, Jacob. You heard her scream, didn't you? My knees nearly buckled. I ran into the room, and Emil was grinning like a madman, notebook in hand. They know us now, he said. Sophie screamed at him, begged him to unplug it, but he refused. This is history talking to us. Truth. No one else has the guts to hear." Later, the transmitter whispered Sophie's name, describing the street where she grew up, the shortcut she took to school as a kid. She turned white, shaking so badly I had to hold her up. Emil wouldn't stop listening, though. He sat there like it was feeding him. I barely recognized him anymore. The third night, things broke. The voice on the radio described Emil in detail: his jacket, the scar on his chin, the way he tapped his foot when he was nervous. "You don't think anyone saw you," it said, calm and cold. "But I did. By the dumpsters behind the pub. She begged." Emil's face drained of all color. He lunged at the transmitter, shaking it, screaming, "Liar, that's not true!" But the voice just repeated it, over and over like a mantra. Sophie clapped her hands over her ears, screaming. I didn't know what to believe. Emil had always been off. He drank too much, sometimes vanished for days. Could he have? I shoved the thought away, but it stuck like a thorn in my brain. Emil turned on us, eyes bloodshot. "You think I did something? You believe that machine over me?" He grabbed my collar, shaking me. "Say it! Say you know it's lying!" I shoved him off, and for the first time I realized I was scared of him. Sophie ran outside, tears streaming. I followed, leaving Emil alone with the thing. The night air felt cleaner, but my stomach churned. Sophie clutched my arm. "We have to leave, now." I nodded, but before we could move, the cabin windows glowed faintly, and Emil's scream tore through the night. We froze. He screamed again, then silence. I forced myself back inside. Emil was on the floor, twitching, blood trickling from his ears. The transmitter sat humming, untouched. I unplugged it with shaking hands, wrapped it in a blanket, and shoved it into the corner. Emil was breathing, barely, but he wouldn't open his eyes. We carried him to the hospital the next morning. Doctors said it was a seizure, maybe triggered by stress. They kept asking what he'd been exposed to. We said nothing. Sophie refused to stay another night. She packed and left on the next ferry. And I don't blame her. Emil never came back to school. His parents took him home, and I stopped hearing from him altogether. Some say he's in a care facility now, unable to speak. As for me, I went back to the cabin weeks later, when I thought I was strong enough. The blanket was still in the corner, but the transmitter was gone. No broken glass, no footprints, no explanation. Just gone. I never told anyone, not even Sophie, because I know how it sounds. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I hear that hum again. Low, steady, patient. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to dig it up. Story number 8. I woke up to the sound of the sea crashing harder than usual against the rocks, and for a moment I thought the lighthouse itself had shifted in its foundation. My husband was already out of bed, his boots clattering faintly on the wooden floor as he went about his morning routine. Living in that lighthouse outside Seyðisfjörður, you grew used to the sounds. Wood creaking, waves roaring, wind whistling through cracks. But that morning, something about the rhythm of it all unsettled me. I pushed myself up, pulled the blanket tight around my shoulders, and realized I had woken from a dream I couldn't fully remember, except that someone had been whispering my name over and over. I didn't say anything to him at first. I sat at the table with my coffee, letting the steam sting my face as I watched him pull on his coat and prepare to head up to the light. He'd been the keeper for years, and I had joined him after our marriage, convinced by his charm and the idea of a life away from the noise of the city. But it had been weeks since anyone had visited or radioed in, and the isolation had begun to press on me like a weight I couldn't shift. That morning, when I finally spoke, I asked him if he had heard me talking in my sleep. He looked at me strangely, shook his head, and said I hadn't made a sound. That unsettled me more than if he had admitted I had. The fog that day was thicker than usual, rolling in like it had a mind of its own. From the kitchen window, I couldn't even see the rocks below, though I could hear the waves smashing against them. It wasn't just fog, though. It glowed faintly, as if there were lights buried inside it. Not strong, not like lanterns or boats, but flickers, as though something moved within it. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, but then I saw it again, like a small white flame drifting past, vanishing, and then another behind it. My husband dismissed it when I told him, muttering something about my eyes playing tricks. But I knew what I had seen. That night, while he slept, I sat at the table and wrote a letter. I told myself it was silly, but I needed proof of what I was feeling. I described the lights, the fog, and the whispers that followed me into my dreams. My hand trembled as I wrote, because even as I scribbled the words, I swore I heard footsteps upstairs, in the very room where the lantern rotated above us. My husband would have laughed, told me it was the wood contracting in the cold, but I couldn't bring myself to go check. Instead, I tucked the letter beneath the kettle so I could show him in the morning. The following day, he was in a foul mood, frustrated by the oil shipment that hadn't come. Supplies were thinning, and he had been rationing carefully. I tried to show him the letter, but he brushed it aside, irritated. He told me I was making things harder by inventing nonsense. His dismissal hurt more than I admitted, and I felt small, like a burden he hadn't meant to take on. Later, when he went out to check the moorings, I slipped the letter into a tin box where I kept old photos, determined to keep it safe. Days stretched. The fog never lifted. At night, I heard whispers through the walls. Sometimes it was my name, other times just faint sounds I couldn't decipher. One night I woke because my husband wasn't beside me. I found him standing barefoot in the kitchen, staring at the window, his breath fogging the glass. When I asked him what he was doing, he turned slowly, his eyes dazed, and muttered, "They're waiting." I demanded to know who, but he just shook his head like he hadn't realized he'd spoken at all. He went back to bed without another word. I lay awake until morning, listening to him breathe, wondering if I was losing him. It was the letters that kept me sane. Every day I wrote one, describing what I felt, what I saw. I hid them in the tin box. Sometimes I'd hear tapping on the glass panes, like fingertips, and I'd write that down too. Other times I thought I smelled smoke, though there was no fire, only the oil lamps we carefully maintained. One morning, I opened the box and found one of my letters gone. I tore through the kitchen, panicking, asking my husband if he had read them. He swore he hadn't even known I was writing anything. His denial was convincing, but I couldn't shake the certainty that someone had taken it. One evening, I was boiling water when I heard footsteps again. Not upstairs this time, but outside on the gravel path. I froze, kettle in hand, straining to hear. My husband was repairing something in the shed, and I knew the sound hadn't been him. The steps were slow, deliberate. I wanted to call out, but my throat locked. Instead, I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. For a moment, silence. Then a whisper so soft it might have been my imagination. "Open." I backed away, heart pounding, staring at the latch, convinced it would lift on its own. It didn't. But I didn't sleep that night, and when my husband came in, smelling of oil and frustration, I didn't tell him. I couldn't. Eventually, even he began to falter. One night, as we sat at the table, he said, "I think there's a ship out there." His voice was low, almost embarrassed. He described seeing lanterns moving in the fog, as if a vessel had anchored just beyond the rocks. I asked if he'd signaled back. He shook his head, looking uneasy. "It wasn't right," he said. They weren't steady lights. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. That was worse than the whispers. If he was frightened, then I knew it wasn't just me. The tension between us grew sharp. He spent more time outside, checking the equipment, while I stayed in, guarding the letters, writing more each day. One morning, I woke to find his side of the bed empty. I searched the entire lighthouse and the shed, but he was gone. Panic surged through me, and I ran down to the rocks, shouting his name until my throat ached. His boots were by the door, which meant he hadn't left prepared. I scoured the shoreline until my legs gave out, but there was nothing. Only the fog curling around me like it wanted to pull me in. I stumbled back inside, shaking. I tried the radio, my hands trembling as I turned the knobs, begging for a signal. Static. Always static. I screamed into it anyway, hoping someone might hear. No one did. Alone, I began reading my letters aloud at night, as if they could anchor me. Sometimes, after I read one, I thought I heard a faint echo of my words, like someone was repeating them from the fog. I stopped reading them aloud after that. The days blurred. I don't know how long I waited, surviving on rationed bread and water. The whispers never stopped. Once, I woke with my shoes neatly placed at the foot of the bed, though I knew I hadn't worn them. Another time, I found wet footprints leading from the door to the kitchen, though the floor had been clean the night before. I began sleeping in the chair, too afraid to lie down. When the rescue team finally arrived, weeks later, they told me, I wasn't myself anymore. I remember hearing their boots on the gravel, voices calling out, but I couldn't move. I had hidden myself in the kitchen corner, clutching the tin box, convinced if I let go, the whispers would take me too. They broke the door in, their voices sharp, real, cutting through the fog in my head. I tried to answer, but only a rasp came out. My throat was raw from silence. They pulled me outside, and the cold air hit me like a slap. One of them asked me where my husband was. I could only shake my head. They searched, but they never found him. The letters, they gathered them too, though one was missing. The very first one I had written. I told them about it, begged them to find it, but they insisted nothing else was there. I don't know if I believed them. Later, when they ferried me back to the mainland, I realized I had left my shoes behind in the corner of the kitchen. I had slipped them off in a moment of exhaustion, too drained to notice. By the time I thought of it, it was too late. The shoes stayed there, abandoned in that lighthouse while I was carried away. The whispers didn't follow me, but sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I feel the fog pressing against the glass of my window, and I wonder if they're still waiting. And the truth I never tell anyone but you is this. I don't believe my husband vanished. I think he walked into that fog willingly. I think he answered when they called his name. Story number 9. I was already too far up the trail when the rain turned sharp and icy, the kind that slices into your cheeks and soaks you right through. I remember tightening the hood of my jacket and cursing at myself for ignoring the forecast. I'd wanted the solitude, the clean escape of a late hike before heading back to Tromsø. But when the clouds came crashing down on me, it was less freedom and more punishment. I was shivering, my boots filling with meltwater when I saw it. Just a faint orange glow between the trees, at first. I thought maybe I was hallucinating from the cold, but the more I squinted, the clearer it became. A cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and a soft, inviting light spilling from its window. I hesitated on the path, telling myself it was stupid to trust something I didn't know existed on the map. But the sting in my fingers and the numbness in my toes left me little choice. I pushed through the dripping trees until the shape came into view. A small, sturdy-looking log cabin, the kind that seemed older than the pines around it. The door was slightly ajar, a yellowish glow from inside. I called out in English, then in broken Norwegian, "Hello, anybody here?" But the only answer was the hiss of rain. My throat tightened with unease, yet I stepped onto the threshold and nudged the door open. Inside was warmth. Not imagined warmth, but actual heat from a fire crackling in the stone hearth. The smell of burning wood mixed with something faintly sweet, like herbs. There was a wooden chair by the fire, a table with nothing on it, and against the far wall a cot with neatly folded blankets. Empty, but lived in. My relief was stronger than my fear. I peeled off my soaked jacket, tugged off my boots with difficulty, and set them close to the fire. My socks squelched as I peeled them away from my skin, and I laughed a little to myself, half in exhaustion. I remember whispering, "Thank you, whoever you are," to the empty air. I pulled one of the blankets from the cot around my shoulders, sat near the fire, and let the warmth seep back into me. For a while, I must have dozed in and out, jerking awake at every crack of wood in the fire. I had the oddest feeling that if I fell too deeply asleep, I wouldn't wake up. My body wanted rest, but my brain was on edge. There was something off about the silence. Outside, I could hear the rain thrumming the roof, but inside the cabin, even the fire seemed too controlled, too steady, as though someone was tending it behind my back. At some point, I sat up sharply. I was sure I'd heard breathing that wasn't mine. Slow, deep, steady inhalations, like someone asleep in the same room. I scanned the corners, under the cot, even pressed my ear against the wall, but I found nothing. The air was warm and heavy, though, thick enough that it felt wrong to inhale. I decided I'd stay just long enough for my boots to dry, then leave. I didn't want to test the kindness of a stranger's shelter. By morning, when the storm had eased to a drizzle, my boots were damp but wearable. I slid them on, left the blanket folded neatly back on the cot, and whispered another thanks into the silence. When I stepped outside, I nearly cried in relief to see the sky graying instead of pouring. I trudged back toward the trail and eventually made it down to the road, where I hitched a ride into Tromsø with a farmer heading to town. That evening, over hot coffee in the hostel common room, I mentioned the cabin to the woman at the front desk. Her face changed immediately. First confusion, then discomfort. "There's no cabin up there," she said in a clipped tone. I laughed, thinking she misunderstood me, and described it. The logs, the fire, the cot, the chimney. She shook her head. "That trail hasn't had any dwellings in decades. You must have mistaken something." I insisted, a little defensively, that I'd left my boots drying by the fire, that I'd touched the cot, that I'd wrapped myself in the blanket. She pressed her lips together and murmured, "You should not speak about that. People here do not talk of such things." Then she excused herself and left me sitting there, stunned. For the next couple of days, I couldn't shake it. I even went back up the trail during daylight, determined to prove it to myself. I retraced my steps, checking the trees, scanning the ridges. Nothing. No cabin. Not a hint of smoke. Not even the indentation of a structure in the earth. Just forest and silence. My skin prickled with a mix of shame and fear. Was I so cold and exhausted that I dreamed the whole thing? But then, how had my clothes dried? On the third morning, as I left my room in the hostel, I stopped short. Right at the door, neatly aligned on the welcome mat, were my boots. Cleaned, polished almost, the mud gone, the laces tied into neat bows. I froze. I hadn't left them outside. I hadn't even taken them off since I returned from the trail. I looked around, but the corridor was empty, the other doors shut. My heart hammered as I picked them up, turning them over in my hands. The leather smelled faintly of wood smoke, the same smell as the cabin. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. How do you explain that someone returned your boots from a place that supposedly doesn't exist? I wore them the rest of the trip, but every step felt wrong, like I was carrying something I hadn't consented to. At night, when I tried to sleep, I kept imagining the sound of that steady breathing in the cabin, just behind me. I left Norway soon after, but the memory has never left me. I've replayed it 100 times, questioned every detail. I know what I felt when I stepped into that warmth. I know the fire's heat was real, the blanket's weight was real. I didn't imagine my boots being taken and returned. The only conclusion I can make, as much as I wish I couldn't, is that there are places we stumble into that shouldn't exist. Places that borrow from us and give back in ways we don't want. I've never hiked alone again, not because I fear the wilderness itself, but because I can't risk stumbling onto another place like that cabin. And if I ever do, if another door swings open to let me in, I don't think I'll be allowed to leave so easily the next time. Story number 10. I was halfway down the hallway when I noticed the pale glow outside our living room window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the porch light bouncing off the snow, but then I saw the distinct shapes spreading across the yard, arms and legs etched into the white. Snow angels. More than one. And one of them was being made in that exact moment, the shape still forming as though someone was moving in the snow. My stomach twisted, because my daughter Emily was asleep in her room, tucked in tightly after her bedtime story. Yet what I was seeing looked exactly like her small body pressing into the snow, arms sweeping side to side, legs moving in rhythm. I called my wife, Leah, who had just finished washing dishes, and pulled her to the window. She gasped when she saw it, too. "It looks like her," she whispered, her voice trembling. But she was right. It wasn't possible. Emily had been restless the night before, so tonight we'd locked her window from the inside, just to make sure she wouldn't sneak out or open it in her sleep. My heart thumped harder when I realized the curtains in her room were still drawn, undisturbed. She was definitely inside. But outside, the figure that looked like her was still moving, brushing perfect arcs into the snow. I didn't even think. I sprinted to Emily's room, yanked open the door, and flicked on the light. There she was, curled beneath her blanket, breathing slow and steady, clutching the stuffed rabbit she never slept without. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion so sharp it hurt. I shook her gently, and she stirred, blinking groggily at me. "Daddy? What's wrong?" she murmured. I couldn't answer right away. I just stared at her, then glanced back toward the window where I could still see the faint reflection of the yard. I left her with Leah and ran back to the living room. The snow angel outside was finished now. Whoever or whatever had made it was gone, leaving only the untouched snow all around it. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed my face closer, scanning for footprints. There weren't any. Just the angel shape, pristine, as though someone had dropped from the sky, moved in place, then vanished into thin air. I felt my throat tighten. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe a gust of wind, maybe the snow collapsed in some strange way, but no wind I'd ever seen could mimic the weight and movement of a child's body. Leah joined me, clutching Emily's blanket in her hands like a shield. "Did you see her? She's inside?" she asked. I nodded, but my voice cracked when I whispered back, "Yeah, she's in bed. It wasn't her." We didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that angel shape forming, the arms sweeping back and forth as if mocking me. The next morning, the angel was still there, crisp and untouched. The sunlight almost made it look innocent, like the kind of thing kids did on snow. Days. But it wasn't innocent, because I knew what I saw. I shoveled the snow over it, flattening the yard until it was spotless again, and told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, Leah shook me awake. I blinked in the dark and saw her pale face hovering inches from mine. "They're back," she whispered. I bolted upright and hurried to the window. My stomach dropped. This time there were 3 angels in the yard. 1 larger, 2 smaller, side by side, arms stretched as if they were holding hands. And in the far corner, the snow was stirring again, slowly forming another one, as if someone invisible was lying down and pressing their shape into the ground. I rushed to Emily's room, terrified of what I might, or might not, find. She was still there, asleep, though her breathing was heavier this time, almost like she was struggling through a dream. Her forehead glistened with sweat. When I touched her arm, it was ice cold, even under the blanket. I shook her awake. "Em, wake up, sweetheart." She sat up with a start, her eyes wide. "Daddy, I don't like them," she whispered before I even asked. My skin prickled. "Who?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Her small voice shook. "The ones who play in the snow. They keep calling me." I couldn't breathe for a second. Leah came in and wrapped her arms around Emily, but I couldn't look away from the window. The angels outside were still multiplying. That night I didn't just watch, I stepped outside. The air bit my skin as I walked into the yard, boots crunching over fresh snow. The angels lay in perfect formation, as if waiting. I crouched down by one, brushed my glove across it, half expecting to find warmth. But the snow was colder than anything I'd felt before, almost painfully so, like dry ice. "Who's there?" I shouted into the night, my voice shaking. My words echoed against the houses down the block, but nothing answered. No footsteps, no sound except the blood rushing in my ears. Then, faintly, I heard laughter. High-pitched, like children playing, but stretched too thin, unnatural, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I bolted back inside and locked the door. The following days were worse. Emily started waking up with bruises on her arms, faint patterns that looked like handprints. She swore she dreamed of lying in the snow, unable to move, while voices told her she belonged with them. Leah tried to pray aloud every night, clutching Emily close, but I could see the cracks forming in her faith. I started leaving the porch light on, then floodlights. Then I even tried sprinkling salt across the yard. Nothing worked. The angels always returned, sometimes single, sometimes in groups, spreading farther each night. One evening I caught something new. I'd set up an old camcorder facing the window, hoping to prove to myself that it was just paranoia. When I rewound the tape, my chest tightened. There was no figure, no person, but the snow flattened as if pressed by weight, arms and legs moving in rhythm. And just before the tape cut to static, I heard Emily's voice on the audio track, clear as day, though she'd been asleep in her room. "Daddy, come outside." That broke me. I knew then it wasn't random. They wanted her. We packed bags, planning to leave Whitehorse and stay with Leah's sister in Vancouver. On our last night, I insisted we all sleep in the living room, together, with the lights on. I placed Emily between us, but sometime in the night I woke to cold air on my face. The front door was wide open. Snow blew across the floor. Emily was gone. I ran barefoot into the yard, screaming her name. My breath tore at my lungs as I scanned the snow. There were angels everywhere, overlapping, stretching across the yard into the street. In the very center lay a fresh one, smaller than the rest. Emily's rabbit was lying in the middle of it. Leah stumbled out behind me, sobbing. We dropped to our knees, clawing at the snow, digging like mad, but there was no body beneath. just cold, endless white. We dug until our hands bled, until our neighbors came out to drag us inside. The police searched for days. They found no footprints, no evidence of kidnapping, no sign of anyone coming or going. Just the impossible truth that a child vanished from her locked home into the snow. Leah never forgave herself. I never forgave myself either. They told us to accept she was gone, maybe taken, maybe worse. But I couldn't. A week later, I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and looked out the window. The angels were gone. Every one of them. The yard was smooth, untouched, like nothing had ever happened. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over. But then I saw it. In the center of the yard, carved perfectly into the ice, were 5 words. "She's with us now, Daddy." That was the last night I lived in that house. We sold it and left Whitehorse, but leaving didn't help. Because sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the world is quiet, I hear Emily's laughter echoing just beyond the window, calling me to lie down and make angels with her. And I know that if I ever give in, if I ever step outside again, I won't come back either. Story number 11. I didn't plan on working that night. Truth is, I'd already handed in my notice, shook the foreman's hand, and told my wife I was finished. 30 years underground is enough for any man. But when Harold came to me at the diner that morning, looking pale and desperate, saying his boy was sick and he couldn't cover the night shift, I couldn't say no. One last time, I told myself. One final walk into the mountain before I could hang up my lamp for good. The cage lowered me and 2 other men into the shaft just before sundown. The groan of the lift chains echoed around us, rattling against steel. I remember clutching my lunch pail and thinking how heavy the silence felt between the 3 of us. They were young, just starting their lives, and I could see them glance at me with that look men give an old-timer. Part respect, part pity. They knew I was supposed to be gone already. But I nodded at them, said nothing. Down there, words often carried further than you'd expect. Once we split off, I headed down the southern drift alone. My job was simple. Check the supports, make sure the props were holding where the wall had been blasted last week. Routine work, the kind you can do half asleep. I walked slow, boots crunching on loose coal, lamp beams sweeping across wet stone. My mind kept wandering to my wife, to how she'd be cooking supper and wondering why I always had to take on another man's load. 30 years married, and still she worried each time I went down. I was halfway through checking a row of timbers when I heard it. A cough. Quick, muffled, like someone clearing dust from their throat. I swung my lamp down the tunnel. Empty. The boys I'd ridden with had gone the opposite way. No one should have been near me. For a moment I told myself it was just echo. This mountain carried noises in strange ways. I set my jaw and bent back to my work. But then came a voice. "Tommy, hand me the drill." Clear as if the man was standing behind me, my stomach clenched. Tommy. That name hadn't been spoken in years. Tommy had been buried alive in '68, when the roof gave in on Section 9. I worked beside him that day. I never forgot his hand sticking out from the rubble before they pulled us all back for safety. I turned in a slow circle, lamp trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. Only the drip of water answered. Still, I couldn't shake the sound of that voice, low and casual, as if a shift had never ended. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out more like a cough. Talking to yourself was dangerous down here. It meant the dark was getting to you. I pressed forward. The deeper I walked, the stranger it got. My lamp flickered, dimmed, then flared bright again. The air smelled off, like burnt oil and rotten eggs. I felt it in my teeth, a kind of vibration. Ahead, the walls narrowed where the crew had braced them with fresh wood, As I shined my lamp, I froze. The crossbeam that had been nailed up yesterday was gone. Not broken. Gone. The bolts lay neatly on the ground, as though unscrewed by hand. My chest went cold. Safety walls weren't toys. Someone removing them could kill a dozen men in a collapse. I crouched to pick up one of the bolts, still warm, as if it had just been turned. My mind spun. Who the hell would take them out, and why? "Shift ain't over yet, Bill." That voice again, right behind me. I whipped around, lamp shaking. Nobody. Just black rock and dripping seams. But I knew that voice. It belonged to Earl Jenkins, another man crushed in '72 when the roof caved in near the main shaft. My throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I started moving faster, muttering to myself, "You're tired, you're hearing things, it's nothing." But the further I went, the louder it got. Whispers bouncing down the tunnel, snippets of conversations I remembered from decades ago. Men laughing, someone cursing about the foreman, the clink of a lunch pail. All of them voices I'd known, all belonging to men long dead. I broke into a sweat. My legs felt weak. I thought of turning back, but something drove me forward. Stubbornness, pride, maybe fear of admitting I was scared out of my wits. I wanted proof, something I could point to when I got out, so I wouldn't think myself crazy. Up ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber where we'd been driving a new cut. I lifted my lamp and froze solid. 3 sets of safety props had been removed, stacked neatly against the wall like firewood. The roof above groaned, dust sifting down in lazy drifts. My scalp prickled. One more shift in the wrong place and the whole ceiling would come down. I heard boots behind me. Slow, heavy steps. My mouth went dry. I didn't turn around at first. Then, with my heart pounding, I swung my lamp. The beam caught nothing. Empty stone. But the steps kept coming, closer, until I felt the vibration under my feet. "Don't stay," a low voice whispered. Not cruel, not mocking, more like a warning. I staggered back, pressing against the wall. My hand brushed the stacked timbers, and I realized they were damp. Not from water, but from something thicker. My fingers came away dark. In the lamplight, I saw it was blood. Fresh, still warm. My knees almost buckled. I gasped, turned, and ran. My lamp swung wildly, throwing shadows across the walls. Voices chased me, dozens now, calling my name, calling each other's, laughing, coughing, screaming. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, walls closing in. I tripped, caught myself, stumbled forward with lungs burning. At last, I saw the faint gleam of another lamp ahead. Relief hit me so hard I nearly wept. It was one of the young guys, Charlie, standing where the drift met the main shaft. He looked up as I rushed toward him. "Bill, you okay? You look like you seen a ghost." I grabbed his arm, gasping. "We gotta get out, now. The props are gone. The roof's gonna go." My voice was raw, frantic. He frowned. "What do you mean gone? I just walked through there half an hour ago. Everything was fine." "Not anymore," I snapped. "I saw it with my own eyes. We gotta warn the others." We hurried back towards the cage, shouting for the rest of the crew. I remember Charlie's face pale in the lamp glow, his eyes darting around like he didn't know whether to believe me. By the time we gathered the others and went back to the chamber, my stomach was twisted tight. But when we got there, the props were back in place. Every single beam stood solid, bolts tight, not a speck of dust out of place. The chamber looked exactly as it should, safe and steady. No blood, no stacked wood, nothing. I felt the ground drop out from under me. The men muttered, shooting me wary looks. Charlie shook his head. "You sure you didn't imagine it? Long shift, last day? Sometimes the dark gets to a man." I wanted to argue, but my voice failed. My hand still trembled, and I swore I could smell that burnt egg stench clinging to my clothes. But I said nothing. I let them think I'd lost it. Maybe it was better that way. When the cage lifted us back to the surface at dawn, I stepped out and swore I'd never go back down again. And I didn't. That was my last shift. But here's the thing, the part I've never told anyone but you. 2 weeks later, a collapse hit that very section. Took 5 men. Buried them alive. They said a support beam had been loose, that someone must have miscalculated the load. But I knew better. I'd seen those walls stripped bare. I'd heard those voices calling me back, like they weren't done with me yet. Sometimes, at night, when the house is quiet, I swear I still hear them. Tommy, Earl, the rest, calling my name in that same easy tone, like I'm just late to the shift. And I wonder if I only made it out because the dead decided to give me a warning, or maybe because they're still waiting, down in the dark, for me to come back and finish what I started. Story number 11. I was gripping the railing harder than I realized, my knuckles stiff from the cold, when I saw the ferry's lights fade across the channel. I'd missed it by less than 10 minutes, and the reality sank into my chest like a stone. I wasn't leaving Sitka that night. The storm was already rolling in, and the handful of hotels near the dock were full. I cursed under my breath, paced the lot, then spotted the cannery on the far end of the shore, boarded up windows, rusted siding, but at least it had a roof. I told myself it would be just one night, just until the morning ferry. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward it, the gravel crunching louder than it should have in the empty dark. The door gave way after some pushing, and the smell hit me first. Old brine, mildew, and something sharp that reminded me of rust but deeper, almost metallic. Inside, the air was heavy. My boots echoed across warped floorboards, and I made my way into the main hall where conveyor belts still stood, covered in dust. I picked a corner near some crates, dropped my duffel, and sat down. I should have been relieved to get out of the cold, but instead I felt watched, like the cannery itself was aware of me. I shook it off, told myself it was just nerves. I was alone, or so I thought. I hadn't been sitting long before I noticed the stains. At first I figured they were oil patches, the kind that bleed through wood after years of use. But when I leaned closer, running my fingers near the edges, I knew better. Dark patches smeared across the planks, some of them overlapping footprints, as though someone had walked through blood and paced this very hall. My stomach tightened. I tried to reason it away. Maybe animals had gotten in. Maybe hunters used the place at some point. But the more I stared, the more deliberate it seemed. Trails led deeper inside. I should have left right then, walked back into the storm and slept under the ferry terminal awning. Instead, I followed. Each step creaked, and the air seemed to thicken. At the back of the hall, I found a door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside was a small office, broken chair, shelves sagging with ledgers, and a desk with drawers half open. I pulled one open and froze. Journals. Not ledgers, not business logs, but personal diaries. The first one was from a man named Leon, dated 1977. His handwriting was rushed, shaky, and each page worse than the last. He wrote about strangers loading boxes at night, about men with knives who didn't belong to the cannery. By the end, his entries became frantic pleas, saying he couldn't leave, that they were watching him. I dug through more. One belonged to a woman named Elsie, same year. She mentioned workers disappearing, whole shifts vanishing overnight. She wrote of screaming she heard from the dock, muffled by waves. The last line in her book was smeared, but I could make out, "I think they're in the walls." My pulse hammered in my Ears. These weren't ghost stories. They were records, breadcrumbs of real people who had vanished. I sat back hard, the chair legs scraping. That's when I heard it. A thud from somewhere upstairs, too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate to be the building settling. I froze, my breath shallow. Another thud, closer this time, followed by a dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My first instinct was to bolt, but I couldn't force my legs to move. I sat there gripping the journal as though it were a weapon, whispering to myself that I was just imagining it. But then came the unmistakable creak of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, one after another. I shoved the diaries back, grabbed my duffel, and slipped out into the hall. I tried to move quietly, but the floor betrayed me with every groan. I aimed for the front door, but halfway there I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure. Not clear, just the outline of someone watching from the catwalk above. I froze. The shape leaned forward slightly, as though studying me. My throat went dry. I forced myself to speak, my voice cracking. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it, like weight pressing down on my chest. I backed away, keeping my eyes locked on the catwalk. I reached the exit, shoved the door open, and stepped into the freezing air. I should have run, but something stopped me. The sound of a voice, low and strained, calling from inside. "Don't leave me here." It wasn't a demand, it was a plea. Against every shred of reason, I turned back. The hall was empty again. I stepped inside, shaking, whispering, "Who's here?" No answer, but my eyes fell on another door, one I hadn't noticed before, bolted with a rusted latch. The voice had come from there. I forced the latch down, pulled the door, and the smell hit me harder than before. Rot, old fish, and something worse. The room was narrow, lined with crates. I lifted a lid and staggered back. Inside wasn't fish. It was old clothing, stiff with dried stains. Piled, layered, as though someone had been collecting the garments of people who'd never left. The voice came again, louder now, echoing from deeper in the room. "Please." My legs trembled, but I moved forward, weaving between crates until I reached the back. A stairwell descended into darkness. I didn't want to go down, but the air above felt heavier than the void below, and so I stepped down. The basement was colder, the air damp. My flashlight beam cut across walls lined with hooks, dozens of them, some still holding jackets, gloves, even hats. In the center of the room was a table scarred with deep gouges, and beside it, a box half open, stuffed with more journals. I picked one up. The handwriting was different, more recent, dated 1979. The entries were short, clipped, almost like inventory. 3 tonight, 2 last week. 1 tried to run. The final page chilled me most. Storm coming. Last ferry gone. He'll be here soon. I dropped it and staggered back, my chest tightening. Someone had written about me before I even arrived. My mind spun, trying to make sense of it, but then I heard the footsteps again. Not above, not distant, but coming down the very stairs I had used. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I ran. I don't remember thinking, just moving, crashing through crates, scraping my shoulder on the doorframe as I bolted upstairs. The steps behind me didn't quicken, but they followed. I burst into the hall, sprinted for the exit, and didn't stop even when the cold air burned my lungs. I ran until I reached the shoreline, where the storm whipped the waves into chaos. I turned back only once. The cannery stood silent. No light, no movement. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I spent the rest of the night huddled near the terminal, too afraid to close my eyes. When the morning ferry arrived, I boarded first, shaking so badly I dropped my ticket twice. I told myself I'd never mention it, that it was just fear, exhaustion, tricks of the mind. But as the ferry pulled away, I looked back. In one of the top windows of the cannery, I saw a face watching. It wasn't shadow. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there. Years have passed, but I can't shake the weight of those diaries, the piles of clothing, the voices begging not to be left behind. Sometimes I wonder how many families still wait for word of the ones who vanished. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone to the police. But then I remember the journal predicting me, my arrival, as if the place itself knew I'd come. That thought keeps me silent. Because if it knew me once, maybe it still does. And when the nights are quiet and storms hit the shore, I sometimes hear that voice again in the back of my head. Don't leave me here. That's the end of our 10 Alaskan horror stories. Which one sent chills down your spine? If you made it this far, drop "The ice is watching" in the comments. And remember, in Alaska's silence, something is always listening.